So after having looked at the evidence from various observational studies, let us now examine the evidence from randomized control trials, which are similarly widely regarded as the gold standard of evidence-based medicine. And first question in that regard ought to be, what is the quality of the available randomized control trials on HPV vaccines? And here, what you want to keep in mind is that all of the randomized control trials on HPV vaccines were performed by the vaccine manufacturer. So first, again, it is good to look at systematic reviews. And here is a systematic review done by Peter Gøtzsche and his colleagues. And they included in this review a total of 22 trials and 2 follow-up studies. And I know Peter Gøtzsche personally, and I know that he has read all the clinical study reports from these clinical trials. And these are huge documents, I mean, thousands of pages. And I don't think there is a person in this world other than the HPV vaccine manufacturers that knows more about clinical trials than does Peter Gøtzsche. So you can, and he is an exceptionally good scientist. And so what were the main findings of the review? Well, basically, they judged all the 24 studies to be at high risk of bias. And what in particular was the source of that bias? Well, first, no study used the actual placebo, contrary to what our doctor here said, Neda Ferencic-Vrban.
Yeah. I had the interview with Dr. Neda Ferencic-Vrban. She's the leader of Croatian Alliance for Fighting Against Cancers, League of Cancers. And I asked her personally about this clinical trials and placebo, double-blind placebo groups. And she said that each trial using double-blind placebo group, even in my interview with Aaron Siri, he showed me on the screen, he showed me FDA documents. And in the FDA documents, there is showing that they are not using double-blind placebo group, they are using aluminum adjuvant in a group, they call it placebo. And they show that there is a 2.3% of autoimmune diseases in a 6 months period. I asked her, and she said, no autoimmune disease, there is no any side effects, but we will continue, we will come to these side effects. That's very important. That's very important because you can see on my profile this interview, and when I asked her, because I had this information, she just said that I'm provoking her, and she left. And that's why we are here more, because that's how I'm sure that I need to investigate more.
Well, that's normally the argument or the reaction they have when they cannot counter your arguments, they just run away.
Yeah.
So other than not using a placebo, there was also incomplete reporting of serious harms in the clinical trials for as much as 72% of participants. Now, the main findings of the reviews were that at 4 years of follow-up, the HPV vaccines did reduce HPV-related precursor lesions, but they also increased nervous system harms and also general harms. Another important point emphasized by the reviewers is that the clinical studies were mainly designed to assess efficacy and not safety. And for this reason, how much benefits may indeed outweigh the risk remains inconclusive and cannot be concluded on the basis of clinical trial data. Another review of the clinical trials made the point that there remain great uncertainties about HPV vaccine efficacy against cervical cancer, because the randomized control trials did not examine cervical cancer as the outcome, but rather precancerous lesions. And the reason for this is that cervical cancer takes many decades to develop, while the control trials only followed up participants for about 3 years. And so the authors rightly noted that the available data indicated high efficacy against lower grade precancerous lesions, does not necessarily translate to high vaccine efficacy against high-grade SIN3 or worse lesions or cervical cancer. Now, German physicians have made the same point, emphasizing that ignoring uncertainties related to cervical cancer surrogate markers means that decisions at the health policy level as well as the individual level might have been misled. And not only that, they conclude somewhat humorously that the unwarranted confidence in the HPV vaccines has led to the impression that there was no need to actually evaluate their effectiveness. Indeed, the medical establishment apparently just assumed that a miracle would occur from prevention of uncertain surrogates to certain prevention of cervical cancers. The following are a few excerpts from my 2023 letter.
Maybe before we continue, just to repeat again, this is the reason why, and I spoke in the last interview with Mary Holland, she said it was never proven that HPV vaccine is stopping cancers.
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. That's a very important thing because we started with this interview with Mary Holland and she said from the start exactly this sentence you can find in her book, but this is an additional explanation. Why is that statement right?
And so, again, these are some excerpts from my 2023 letter that I wrote in opposition to Bill AB 659, so-called Cancer Prevention Act, requiring mandatory HPV vaccination in California for 8th graders. And first thing is that there are about 200 different HPV types that have been identified thus far, which about 14% are oncogenic and associated with development of various types of cancer. And the 9-valent HPV vaccine Gardasil protects only against 7 of these strains. But the most important here to keep in mind is that the ultimate goal of cancer prevention is to reduce the global burden of cancer, and in order to achieve this, any good HPV vaccine must have demonstrated efficacy against high-grade SIN3 lesions or worse associated with any high-risk HPV types, not merely some. So in that regard, what do the actual vaccine efficacy figures from Gardasil 9 clinical trials show? Well, they show that efficacy against SIN2 lesions or worse, not even SIN3. And SIN2 actually has very high regression rates. But let's just pretend for the sake of the argument that SIN2 is a valid marker for cervical cancer. So what the data show is that there was only just over 60% of efficacy at the end of 3.5 years of follow-up. Now, again, almost half of these lesions will regress spontaneously. So it should be evident from here that a 60% reduction in SIN2 or worse could never translate to even a 40% of reduction in overall cervical cancer mortality. Approximately 60% of reduction of cervical cancer mortality could possibly happen only with a vaccine that had 100% efficacy that was sustained for a long period of time, of several decades. But even then, this vaccine would just be on par with some of the lowest reductions observed related to regular PAP screening programs. So again, even in this highly idealistic imaginary scenario, Gardasil 9 would fail to make any impact on cervical cancer burden in the context of already existing PAP screening programs.
According to this, we can say that the risk is higher than benefit.
Not so fast, but we'll get to that.
Okay.
Now, for some, this whole story about surrogate markers is just too long to be told. It is much simpler to state, just as the vaccine manufacturers do, 100% efficacy against cervical cancer and other HPV-related diseases. And according to this article, again, by the German doctors, in Germany, even their committee for vaccination assumed lifelong protection of over 90%. Now, similar exaggerated statements were made by the Croatian health authorities. They likewise say that Gardasil 9 will prevent 90% of cervical cancer, because the theory is Gardasil 9 targets 7 strains which are collectively responsible for about 90% of cervical cancers. Therefore, Gardasil 9 will prevent 90% of cervical cancers. Now, this theory sounds really good, but the problem is it's actually false, and demonstrably so. So, as was the case in 2013, when Annals of Medicine published my review on HPV vaccines, the actual research data up to this point show that HPV vaccine official narratives are still at odds with evidence-based medicine. And what is also apparent is that health authorities worldwide have failed, and they continue to fail, to provide an evidence-based medicine rationale for population-based HPV vaccination programs, let alone mandatory HPV vaccination laws. So to this date, the main HPV vaccine that is currently on the market, which is Merck's Gardasil, fails and continues to fail every single of the 4 criteria required by the FDA for a fast-track approval, because Gardasil did receive a fast-track approval. And the reason why it fails, because it's neither more safe nor more effective than the methods of cervical cancer prevention that have already been existing for many decades.